Hello, everyone, and welcome to our lecture on Section 5.8 in Unit 5, Reactions to the Industrial Economy. All right, so let's get started. So the essential question for this section is what conditions led for calls for change in industrial societies and what were the effects of those efforts? So keep that in mind, um, and this could be like a similar to an essay question that you may get on the test, whether it's the unit test or the AP exam. All right, so the first thing you guys want to talk about, or we want to talk about here, is labor unions. Remember, labor unions were organizations formed by industrial workers to demand reforms to their workplaces. And generally, what we were doing is they were responding to the working conditions as well as um, the long hours and low wages that they were experiencing in many of the factories during this time. And unions were basically seeking better rights and to change working conditions, get better wages, have a standard work week, and so forth. Generally, over time, we've seen the influence of labor unions progress to the fact now that we have a minimum wage, shorter work days, a signified or organized work week, such as 5 days a week, and then overtime pay, um, and so forth in many jobs. All right, here, guys, if you take a second, this is a very famous source that you guys need to look at. It's a primary source, it's a political cartoon. What I would do here is pause the video for a second. Please do this and write down what you see. What is ultimately the message of this political cartoon? All right, now that you guys have actually looked at it, you can see here it says the hand that will rule the world, one big union. So it's the idea that the union itself will actually, the workers will come together and rule the world. All right, oops, sorry. Now the next thing we need to talk about are voting rights. And one of the things that unions actually did is they helped as they helped kind of get rights for their workers and so forth. You had these other social movements that were going on as well across the globe, in particular women pushing for the right to vote. And the advancements that unions made actually helped specifically women in their right to vote. And you see suffragettes and that movement, the suffrage movement, really gaining steam during this period. Another thing that actually helps it too is you have in the United States, you have the passage of the 15th Amendment, um, which guarantees the right to vote for African Americans as well. So you're seeing enfranchisement becoming more of a right for people globally during this period. And ultimately, in the late 1800s and into the early part of the 1900s, the first couple of decades, that's when you see most of the countries, at least in the Western world, giving women the right to vote specifically. All right, so next, in terms of child labor, um, because of the conditions and so forth that were existing in factories, because of the push by unions to organize the work week a little bit better, organize better conditions, you actually start seeing a lot of laws that are passed in places like Britain and the United States um, to really restrict child labor. Such as in 1843, you're seeing in Britain they banned children from working in coal mines if they're under the age of 10, and then also making education mandatory for children between the ages of 5 and 10 as well. And you see this movement not just in Britain, but in the United States and many of the other industrialized countries. All right, so now we have, with all this going on, there's actually a significant reaction from the intellectual world during this time as well. And so basically, as production and trade begin to increase globally, you have the intellectual sphere start to look at this unchecked growth of corporations, monopolies, and capitalism in general and start to question it. And one thing I want you guys to look back on is the role that Adam Smith played in the early part of Unit 5 with his Wealth of Nations, where he discussed principles of capitalism and laissez-faire economics and that invisible hand that operates within a free market society. Because this is going to start to help kind of gain an understanding in the intellectual world, at least in terms of questioning the growth of corporations and capitalism. All right, another important person here is John Stuart Mill. He was a British philosopher. He did criticize laissez-faire capitalism saying that it was inhumane towards the workers, and he played a significant role within this period to kind of say, look, we need to change this. You need to have better working conditions. Child labor needs to end, and so forth. And his views became known as utilitarianism, basically because he sought that the greatest good for the he sought for the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Um, and this is important because utilitarianism is kind of a mixture between capitalism, or it's in the middle between capitalism and socialism. And this is this is actually going to gain a little bit more support from people because it's not as radical as socialism, but it also offers some benefits that capitalism is not offering, at least for the workers at this time. And he pushed for gradual reform, saying, look, you need to change this slowly, change things slowly, because if you change things very quickly, you're going to have radical um, actions and push back against it from one side or the other. Right now, Karl Marx, you guys know he's the important man here in terms of when we talk about the intellectual challenge to the industrial societies. And I mean, we just got done reading an excerpt from his Communist Manifesto that kind of, criticizes capitalism. And he says that capitalism creates an unnecessary poverty and misery and divide in society between the proletariat, the working class, and the bourgeoisie, the wealthy and middle class, who actually own the means of production in society. And he says that basically capitalism is solely built to exploit the lower classes or the proletariat. And he is very radical and calls on the proletariat to rise up and ultimately violently try to take down the bourgeoisie and take down capitalism. And what his manifesto is going to lead to is going to lead to the birth of what we call communism. All right, guys, I want you to pause the video here for a second and take a second to actually review this political cartoon and see what are you seeing and kind of analyze what are you seeing here in this political cartoon. All right, now that you guys have actually paused it and kind of looked at it, I hope you see that you have capitalists or bourgeoisie here. The big fat guys are basically wringing out the proletariat or the workers for all they're worth, and they're taking it. And that's kind of this is a connection to what Karl Marx was pushing in his manifesto and why the proletariat needed to openly revolt against the bourgeoisie. All right, here, guys, I would pause this here too. I'm not going to read all of these. Here you can actually see the differences between capitalism and socialism, from ownership all the way to the advantages and disadvantages of these two systems. You should know these. All right, now we're going to move on to some responses in some various places to industrialization. And here we're going to look at the Ottoman response to industrialization. We've actually already kind of talked a little bit about this when we did our introduction to or the basics of nationalism assignment right when we came back from Christmas break. So we're just going to kind of come back to the Ottomans here. So the Ottoman Empire, as you guys know, was in decline in the 19th century. They were being labeled the sick man of Europe. And they had to do a lot of different things to kind of prop themselves up or try to improve themselves to keep this empire afloat. And Sultan Muhammad II, one thing he actually did is he started institute reforms specifically modeled after what the Europeans were doing because he saw it was working for them. If he could try to institute them and have them become effective programs within the Ottoman Empire, he was hoping it would bring them up and bring advancement. One such thing is he abolished the Janissaries, and those that actually revolted in Istanbul were just put to death. And then he ended the feudal system as well within the Ottoman Empire. So basically, you had military officials that could no longer collect taxes to pay their salaries. So they were more beholden to the actual government. And then all tax revenues went to the state itself. So not only did that improve the funding coming into the actual empire, but it made it so that the military officials, the generals, were tied directly to the actual political structure, more so that they actually had to work more with the state. And then he focused on more social services and infrastructure services such as postal system and building of roads. All right. And the next thing, and you can't talk about the Ottoman Empire's response to industrialization without talking about the Tanzimat reforms, and we've already mentioned these as well in that same assignment I mentioned earlier. But remember, the Tanzimat reforms came after Mahmud, and they were built around trying to root out government corruption because corruption was widespread within the Ottoman government. They tried to revamp the education system to improve the education of the people within the empire, making the education more secular, so trying to remove the religious influence that was in primary and secondary schools. You started to see colleges that were developing and becoming more prominent within the Ottoman Empire as well. And the law system was modified and modernized to bring in new laws that were more adaptable and more that related more and were more connection with the modern world. All right, guys, I want you to pause this here as well and kind of take some time, read the description of this political cartoon, and identify what you see. All right, now that you guys have had a little bit of time to, pause it and identify what you see here, um, I hope that you see that this is kind of recognizing what was going on in terms of the reforms within the Ottoman Empire during the industrial age in the latter part of the 19th century. All right, so Ottoman society and economy. So, what was going on after the Napoleonic Wars? When those ended in 1815, you started to see food and crop prices decline across Europe, and this directly influenced the Ottoman Empire as well. And you start to see a new global economy come in place, and you see money flowing directly to America and back into Europe and throughout the Mediterranean basin, which again, that's a concerning point here for the Ottoman society. You start seeing workers paid in cash instead of goods, so you have a monetary system developing. Banking becomes expanded in this region and within the Ottoman Empire because of the influx of money into their economic trading system. And then the other thing that we see here is that we see men gaining the benefit over women because of industrialization in the Ottoman society. You see jobs are primarily going to men. You actually see women's rights in some cases even taken away. So women could no longer hold money from inheritance. They were restricted in education and even restricted in owning property. And this is a huge, huge step back for women um, because of these changes. All right, now that all these changes are going on in the Ottoman Empire, and there are a lot of positives, but there's also some negatives. And there is some opposition that's very strong to these reforms of the Ottoman Empire. Remember, they're going to be known as the sick man of Europe. And one of the reasons why is because of this opposition that comes from these reforms. So the initial reforms that Sultan Abdulhamid supported when he came to power were a new constitution, and he continued to emphasize education and the secularization of the law code in the Ottoman Empire. However, as his rule kept going, he kept tightening and tightening his grip on his control over the empire. And what happened was the Young Turks actually resisted. Now, initially, their resistance movement is actually going to fail, but eventually they're going to gain control. And you're going to see minority groups and minority factions within the Ottoman government gain power and kind of separate and fragment Ottoman government to where even though they fail initially, the Young Turks will gain power. All right, so now we're going to talk about reforms in China. China, they start to industrialize and reform as well. And the movement there for them is called the self-strengthening movement. And you see them trying to advance the technology of their military and as well as training for the military as well. You see British and French and even German advisors that are consulted and even brought in to train their military. There's a diplomatic corps that's set up to work with um, not only the foreigners that are now coming into the country, but also possibly using them to go outside as well and have influence and set up diplomatic relations set up in other countries. There's a customs service that's set up to collect taxes and trade, to make sure that money's getting in correctly to the imperial government in Beijing. So there's a lot of reforms in China going on. Now, one of the most important periods of reform in China were the Hundred Days reforms. And basically, many groups and clubs, they were actually calling for reforms after the Sino-Japanese War. And Emperor Guangzhou, he responded with these reforms. And what he did is he ended the outdated civil service exam. He tried to eliminate corruption as well, which was sort of successful. And he started to institute Western-style industrialization, commercial and medical systems. So we're trying to bring them up on par, at least a little bit, with the industrialized world in the West. Now, here's the thing: this doesn't completely go off without a hitch in China. The Empress Dowager Cixi, she actually becomes the basically de facto emperor or empress controller of China, and takes control and she disagreed with the reforms that were being put in place, and she actually institutes a coup d'état. Guangzhou gets imprisoned and repeals all the reforms. So you see kind of this advancement stopped, and she believed that really what was going on is this foreign influence, this foreign technology was bad for China. And she stopped not only the reforms, but the extension of railroads, telegraph lines, anything that was modern technology in a way. Now, she forced she was forced to reform the civil service system towards the end of her reign. So it wasn't like she was going to keep everything back, and so forth. But if you guys remember in world history classes previously, what we talked about when we talked about China, the Confucian values, and where the civil service exam was linked towards that earlier. Now, during the 19th century in China, one of the reasons why the civil service exam needed to be reformed or even get completely taken out of use was because it became more corrupt. The corruption that was going on in China at that time was terrible, and it actually took something that was good and made it not work. And you started seeing unqualified personnel being put in positions of power, and that's ultimately what led to the downfall of imperial China. All right, so what ultimately happens in China, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about imperialism later, is that the foreign powers that are starting to come into China and establish spheres of influence and trading relationships with China that are beneficial to them, there's going to be a problem, especially with Xi Jinping taking control, the Empress Dowager, and the Europeans are encouraging reforms. But there's also this growing social movement that's going to be known as the Boxers, that push for a return to older society, the older ways, and pushing out modernization in China. And this happens to, even though the Empress Dowager didn't directly support them, but she kind of did because they were basically doing her bidding. It leads to a revolt and a rebellion by the Boxers against the European and American influences in China. And ultimately, what happens is the Boxer rebellion is unsuccessful, and China is forced to accept foreign aid and basically foreign control in a way. Now, all of this, to kind of make a long story short, all of these problems, all of these issues, the power that's taken away from the Chinese imperial government, and the influence of the Europeans and the Americans and the Japanese, all these problems lead to the Chinese empire falling in 1911 and China becoming a republic. Right here, guys, you can see the spheres of influence that I was talking about and the treaty ports and who actually controlled or had influences from Europe and Japan in China in this period. And ultimately, these influences is one of the reasons why the Boxer Rebellion actually started. I would pause this and take a second, look at this map, and then look at the geographic skill builder questions there to kind of help you gain a better understanding. All right, guys, here are a couple. One's a political cartoon from a magazine, a French magazine, on the left, and then you have President Theodore Roosevelt and several officials, the Japanese officials on the right of him, or I guess his left, the right of the screen, and then Russian officials on the left-hand side of the picture or his right. Now I want to touch base on both of these. So on the political cartoon on the left, I want you to pause this for a second and actually look at both of these. But the political cartoon here on the left is, you can see the Chinese figure here is trying to stop Britain, Germany, Russia, Japan, and France from carving up China. So those imperial influences that we see here, these spheres of influences, they are trying to stop that. And then here in this picture, you actually see Theodore Roosevelt with, I believe, and I could be mistaken, but this should be him in New Hampshire, the Treaty of Portsmouth, ending the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. All right, so we have some resistance. We're almost done here in Japan. And what happens in 1871, Japan actually disbanded the samurai. So they were no longer a military force. The samurai couldn't carry their swords. Bushido was now not an official code, and it was only practiced personally. You do see some samurai become elder statesmen and advisors, and they get the title known as generos, or that's what they become known as, excuse me. But you do see some resist and start to clash with the new military and the emperor of Japan. So ultimately what happens is you see a rise of liberalism in Japan, and then it declines. And it's due to some reforms that are taking place. You see improved literacy rates, a rapid industrialization of the economy of Japan, and some democratic institutions come in, such as freedom of press, labor unions, and individual freedoms. And this leads to Japan becoming a power on the world stage. And ultimately, though, however, even though they rise and have these benefits, in the post-World War I period, so the 1920s, you actually see these liberalist reforms, these advancements actually go back down and be kind of squashed, at least for a short period of time, with the military influence gaining control over the government and going back to kind of the old ways in Japan. So here's some limits to reform. This is our last slide here, everybody. So Turkey, China, and Japan, they each followed different paths to industrialization, and each had varying differences of success and failure. And in Turkey, they did start the earliest. So this is the Ottoman Empire. And at first, you do see openness to change, but ultimately, as things move on, because of a number of factors, you see the ruler of the Ottoman Empire become more conservative, and you have a revolt and reform by the Young Turks. In China, they did start in the latter half of the 19th century, but the Empress Dowager gains control, and she's really opposed to the changes, but they will become more liberal after the fall of the imperial government in 1911. And then in Japan, you see rapid changes in the latter half of the 1800s, and they develop the fastest. But ultimately, they're going to see some conservative backlash in the 1920s with the military taking control. But they still industrialize. So even though there's conservatism that takes control in Japan, they still industrialize themselves during this period. All right, guys, that's all I have for you in this lecture. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.